Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. It's tax day in the United States, where it's said the only two certainties are death and AppSec awareness programs delivered by PowerPoint. So what about AppSec taxes? Are they making you remember 5 different names for phishing? You deserve a refund. Are they making you satisfy a password strength calculator instead of offering you passkeys? You deserve a refund. Are they making you listen to Application Security Weekly? You deserve no, wait, that's a good one. You deserve a thank you. Which means this week we chat with Karan Dwivedi about kickstarting your security engineering career and demystifying security engineering career tracks. In the news segment, ARG parsing in Rust, D-Link's deceased hardware, Chrome's V8 sandbox, CSRB's recommendations for Microsoft, and more. Get a refund and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva, a Talis company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
This is episode 281, recorded April 15th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. It's very good to have you back, John. Welcome.
It's good to be back, right until that moment that you had to remind me that it's tax day.
Well, hopefully we'll have you back next week as well, or from some federal penitentiary if you're paying a little bit late. We'll see.
They're usually not that quick to catch me, but I feel it.
Okay, yeah, we'll take that part out of the recording just so there's no evidence. It's good to have you back, John. John and our Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. It's a good breather after you've paid your taxes. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54USecWeekly. We hope to see you there. Karan has led large-scale security projects at Google and Yahoo. At Yahoo, he was part of the security team responding to the world's largest data breach. He also contributed to the latest CVSS 4.0 and has served as an advisor to startups, an editorial board member in international security journals, and judged global competitions. Hello, Karan. Thank you for joining us.
Yep. Thank you for having me, Mike and John. It's awesome to be here. I would love to dive deeper into security engineering topics today. So looking forward.
We appreciate you taking the time because you and your co-author have written a book about a security engineering career. But one of the things, a couple of things that stand out to it about it for me are that the inclusion of engineering in that title. I like that as a distinction because I think you, me, John, for that matter, we started our security, our AppSec careers or our infosec careers, if you will, when there wasn't much of a discipline of security engineering, or it wasn't at least talked about as much. I think the world looked quite different. So maybe tell us a little bit perhaps how you started and what got you motivated to write a book today.
Yeah, it's a great point actually that you mentioned in your question. So let me break that down step by step. So I think back when I started, I think honestly I fell into security. It was a funny story where one night I was a teenager, and one night one of the social media networks out there, I'm not going to say the names, obviously, somebody posted on my profile that I'm going to take over your profile. And, as a teenager who didn't really know about security, like I was just fascinated by computer systems at that point, I was scared, but also extremely intrigued, right? And I spent the whole night figuring out how one can do that. Like, can you really take over my account? Like, are my passwords weak? Like, I started thinking automatically on how to like pen test myself. And I had no idea of the words pen test and red team and blah, blah, blah at that point. Long story short, I decided, hey, like, I want to make the world safer in a way that nobody has to experience the same emotions and, the panic and subsequent research as myself. So really,
A little bit
really,
of fear, yes.
yeah, it really, that was the first impetus. And I've been going on ever since. Like, I decided, hey, kind of worked backwards and looked at people, folks like at that point who were super senior or had careers in security, of like, how did they get started? And I saw a common pattern where they had some engineering experience slash knowledge, right? I'm not going to stick to degrees here, but they had that component. So I said, okay, I'm going to pursue like computer science. Let's make the basics strong. And then if I still feel a huge urge to do more security, I can go specialize. So really that was the starting point to say, I need to go back to the basics. Like, I'm not going to go and study all the crypto algorithms right away. I want to go first understand how it's working on a system, So I think for me, it was just those basics. Long story short, when I finished my bachelor's, I started working a little bit. I took up actually a software engineering role, which was interesting when I look back. So I was, actually designing and coding systems. I was working for, at the time, Honeywell, and they had me integrate some new cameras into their digital video system. It's kind of nice because it's still deployed in Europe and in North America. But seeing that actually made me, crave for more knowledge. I was like, okay, I know how these systems work. It's physical security / software engineering, but I want to specialize more. And, about a year and a half, I joined graduate school. I think it was pretty clear that I wanted to learn more. So I, came to the US, started at Carnegie Mellon. By the way, shout out to those folks because their program is awesome. So when I started there, I think it was like drinking from the fire hose and I saw common patterns, right? It wasn't that they taught me advanced stuff in year one. They had a very nice structure where they actually build the basics. So they actually went deeper into how do you write code that works scalably? How do you understand networks at a deep level? It really resonated with my ideas like that I had. And then, right after that, I think I talked to you, Mike, right? And I think you interviewed me actually for the Yahoo position, if I remember correctly. And I think you were my second interviewer. I'm like, wow, Mike has a lot of experience. I don't know how this will go. Like, this was in my head like a week before the interview. I did not imagine that I will end up in a podcast like 9 years later, talking to you about different stuff. So that's a little bit of history for speakers. But after Yahoo, I think, I joined full time. But then, as you mentioned in the intro, they had the largest breach. I mean, they announced the largest breach. I'll be careful with my words. Obviously, obviously we can't go into details of the breach, but the long story short, there is the engineering aspect didn't change, right? So when I went in, I saw a need for, I could automate a lot of things. I can make this work at scale. How do you do forensics at scale? How do you do analysis? And while you have security ideas, the implementation was always in code. Right? And so I did a lot of that during my time there. And then at Google, when I transitioned after 2 years, Google is very engineering focused, right? Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the company, but my experience is that they are super focused on building the right things and making it work for them. And so, as you can see, like the common thread has been engineering at the back end. Right? And I'm happy to go deeper into separate parts, but that's the long story short of how I got started, the common themes, and why engineering is at the root of everything.
And I definitely want to come back to focus on that engineering, but you started off with that idea of you were curious. And I think that's a common theme. And it's hard to tell, we can't give career advice of just be curious because, nobody, that interview question is, how curious are you? Are you serious? Or are you not, doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But you pointed out one of those things, you had that curiosity, which is an important seed. In school, Carnegie Mellon, I think Purdue has a really good reputation as well for comp sci, but that feels kind of rare, actually. Mm-hmm. how often have you seen at the college level, university level, a focus on comp sci that includes security? And do you see that, in modern
Yeah.
course catalogs today?
So I did a bunch of research before I applied, right? And at that time, I had a spreadsheet. I like to do analysis of what I'm doing, right? So I was like, all right, I have 10 schools, 10 or 12 schools.
Good engineer.
I took a very pragmatic approach at this process. And I rated them based on my probability of getting in, and I sorted and all of that jazz. But long story short, I feel there were not many who had a program super focused on security. They were always components of another degree. Like they would even college certificates, which really I felt a little bit off about it, right? Because I was looking at certifications a little bit differently than, a certificate with a degree. That just sounds off to me, at least personally. What I liked about the program I ended up going to was they had the full focus, right? And just super evident in the curriculum. So one thing I advise people who are even looking for programs, I get a bunch of questions of like, should I do masters or should I go pursue a role? I think it's a very common question. And people are looking at, immediate financial return versus 2 years investment or 5 years investment if they want to do a PhD and then they don't know what's going to happen. So for folks like that, I personally say, go look at the curriculum and go look at who's teaching it. I think that's advice stands for not just degree programs, but also certifications. Like you want to find.
Well, so when you say that, when you say that, what is the syllabus that you would recommend is helpful to them for that engineering, for security engineering? Because you mentioned you didn't start off reading everything about all the crypto systems, crypto algorithms. I did a little bit of that, but I've never written one. It's probably a good idea that I don't. So what is that syllabus, or who? When you say or look at who's teaching it, what are you recommending they look for in that?
Yeah. So what I would recommend is gauge where you are first, right? Not every course or not every certification is designed for everybody, right? It may sound like that, but gauge where you are, as in gauge where your expertise is in maybe 2 or 3 pillars is what I would call them, right? The basic operating system concepts, I would focus as a singular pillar, right? I'll tell why. The second would be computer networking. I'll focus on that. And the third would be obviously security engineering, right? And the first 2 are super critical part of engineering per se, like quote unquote engineering. So what I would look for is an ideal curriculum for me to help somebody, or the one I would go back and take maybe now would be something that teaches you OS 101, something that teaches you advanced OS, something that teaches you intro to networking, and then advanced networking, which means that how protocols work. Like a course that doesn't go into explaining why a particular thing is designed in a way is red flags, right? So those are the attributes I would look for, right? See where they stop.
So is that looking for things like, here's DNSSEC, which we know that the infosec community has opinions on, or DMARC, SMTP. Are these the types of things you're thinking of when you're talking about protocols?
I am, yes. And so it's a good example, right? And I would even go further to say, don't just know the terms. Like I talked to a bunch of people who.
You called me out.
No, not you. But like people who try to.
I know.
People who try to. Me. People who try to impress us in the field, and they throw a bunch of terms at me, and I'm like, okay, look, maybe I don't know this, right? But help me understand how that works. And that open-ended question is good enough to understand where their level of knowledge is. Can they go down to why it's designed the way? I think that's the perfect check I would look for. Actually,
why it's designed that way. That's go ahead, John.
But this is I'm taking this in. I think it's I like where you're going with this, Karan, but at the same time I'm thinking, okay, does anyone who wants to get into AppSec, do they have to go down? You're doing it sounds like sort of a traditional path you were thinking through, like start with the network and work your way up.
Yep.
One of the things that's been on my mind last year or so is, as the stack is getting, both in cloud, as the stack is getting more and more complex, that depth that you have to understand becomes pretty insane. So are we going to have to keep, if someone wants to get into, say, like LLM securities, the current hot sexy thing, do they still need to know about like what your an ICMP packet looks like?
I think that's pretty basic, to be honest. That's a very basic networking protocol. I think you have a point there, John. Let me address that. So, given the swath of products and knowledge that's out there these days, like you hear so many new products coming out. I'm not expecting people to know everything about the products. I'm expecting people to know the most foundational layer. If they know that, here's a check if it's foundational or not. If they know that, can you explain everything else on top? And if the answer is yes, then that's foundational. If the answer is, oh, no, that's built on something else, and then that's your foundational layer. Does that make sense?
So I'm curious about that because I was having this similar, question in the sense of like talking about OS basics.
Yeah.
As we move into containers, we move into lambdas, lots of cloud even, we're starting to abstract a lot of the OS. So I'm curious, do I need to know command line utilities or POSIX APIs or even appreciate the word POSIX or there how do you pull out those differences about cloud and Kubernetes in this conversation?
I think for me, cloud itself is an abstraction, right? I know there's levels like, hypervisor is another layer on top of, this thing and the other thing. The way the place I stop is take a single host and understand that. As in, I'm not building anything on top of anything else. I'm not building a distributed cloud systems that has multiple containers and has a master node. At the end of the day, the lowest level without abstraction is honestly a host on which you can run. I would even call them like some basic programs and understand how that's allocating memory, understand how that's allocating CPU resources. If you know that, that is my level. I'm not seeking. This is a counterintuitive question, which is great, by the way. You both touched on it. Awesome. A lot of people have that confusion when they talk to me, and they're like, I'm really not expecting you to know everything. That's impossible sometimes. I just want you to know here's a machine. It has a compute power. It can store some stuff, and it can take some inputs and give you outputs. Let's talk about that. And then if you know that, you can build anything on top. It's like, a pretty old school technique, I would say. But then it has served as a great test, like great litmus test to how much people know. And there was you had a question, sorry, just 1 second, about the POSIX one. Again, I don't expect people to know that terms, right? But there is history involved that has influenced a little bit of the design of how Unix has evolved and what systems we have today. So I don't expect that terms to be known, obviously, honestly, but I think, again, evolution is something that I would care about because how we reach this state is important.
And part of that, I'm glad you mentioned that, the design part, because that's where I wanted to take part of this question in the conversation, is that security engineering, no one is out there building actually yet another operating system.
Exactly.
And I was going to say protocols, but protocols are still pretty few and far between. We've got HTTP2, obviously HTTP3, but those are slow.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about security engineering, there's also a discussion of what are the authentication patterns, what are good ways to support passkeys. One of my favorite things, web authent. These are some of my favorite areas.
Yeah.
How are those taught? Are those being taught? And how does that work into that idea of security engineering that we're teaching builders, here's a pattern, here's an anti-pattern to avoid, here's, I mentioned authentication, but obviously there's got to be a lot of other things. And that speaks to the idea of that LLM. We're building products.
Yeah.
So, how does that look from a career perspective?
So I think so I can't speak behalf of, I don't know, different university or courses that teach this stuff. I'm going to guess that there are some who do touch upon it, but I have personally not seen them go into, here's a technology that's like the newest, the latest and greatest, and here's how you can use it, because it's about the target audience. If people are trying to break into the field, again, I think their concepts about how authentication works, like two parties trying to figure out if they are who they say they are, is a generic problem that people are trying to solve with different ways. And then it's cat and mouse game of, okay, I found this flaw. Now, what do I do next? So again, in my opinion, as long as they teach you that, then they teach you the best practices today of, what, Kerberos is being used for this reason. Here's why. Oh, here's why it's deprecated. And, we've moved on. Just that is good enough to know, especially for beginners. Like, I want to draw the line of, if we make security too hard for people and say, by the way, you have to know all of these things, we're going to see people like back out or maybe even panic of, oh, like that's too much. But if we actually make it fun for them, like here's how, how this is work. You gamify a little bit of the things and show them, oh, this is interesting because you know what, you can even apply this elsewhere. I think those are aspects that drive people into the field more, from my experience.
Part of that, one of the things we did start talking about, you mentioned Carnegie Mellon, I mentioned Purdue. We've been somewhat university focused for a moment here.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, I don't know that we can make AppSec fun. We try to every week, but but there are different paths that people take into AppSec, as well as just computer programming and security engineering that don't necessarily come through university or come through traditionally a comp sci degree. So part of that, is someone is trying to think of getting into a security engineering career. Is it that idea of look at the OS, look at some protocols, look at some of these primitives? Are there certain other things that they should have in their toolbox? Or maybe how would you recommend, how do they start building that toolbox? Let me ask you that way.
I think this is where I would call out the book, right? And I think big shout out to my co-author, Raaghav. He and I actually worked on this for a few years, and we actually laid out that plan. I think where you're going with your question, Mike, is it's not just about, it doesn't stop at the basics. Yes, you cover the basics. That's step 1 and 2, right? But then we also talk about how you understand different roles. Like we talk about AppSec, we talk about infosec, we talk about detection response. So, the way we layered it was we explained the space in security engineering, right? In our first chapter. In the second chapter, we go into the building the breadth part, which is the basic, right? We talk about all of these things that I touched upon earlier. In the third chapter is where we go into super depth of, hey, if you have chosen, for example, AppSec or detection response, how do you build a profile in that spaces? So that's where we go into, do you know how to play with different SIMs, right? Do you know how Splunk queries work? What are the scaling issues there? How does Splunk API works? We talk about that. We talk about analysis on big data systems. We talk about TSK and autopsy and all those tools. And really going and following the same logic, right? Do you know how this touches the primitives? And if you can explain that, great, right? And so we kind of layered that out. And then there's more, right? Because it's not just knowing stuff, it's also applying. So we talk about skills, what skills you should be developing. We dedicate a sub-chapter on how you choose certifications, which was a topic we were hovering about a little bit in our questions. And then finally...
Yeah, let's talk about, actually, but before we finish that part, let's talk about those aspects you brought up, especially like certifications and tools.
Yeah.
Because there's another aspect here that I want to tease out, is that sometimes people are trying to kickstart their role or start their career, or start at a company versus a career. And this is where, I'm kind of leading in that idea of, do you need to learn the Splunk API? Even though like these handful of companies don't have the budget to buy Splunk. Sorry, I gotta teach you a little bit about that. Do you learn that tool because the company you're targeting and want to get hired in has that tool? Or do you learn the tool? Have you learned the C programming language? And that's, embarrassing to admit in this day and age. We've gone Rust and Go. That leans into certificates too. How does someone figure out this is topical, useful for a career versus a company versus a role?
Yeah. Excellent question, Mike, because we get this a lot. As in, personally, I've seen people ask me, can you help me choose between two, right? And they give me two options. And I will generally turn the question around and say, here are some things that you can think about. And I give a list. For example, again, treat it like a product that you're buying, essentially, and see what you're getting out of it. For example, if you're building a profile in, I guess, let me try to think of an example, but I know a common comparison I get is CEH versus OSCP versus other pen testing, red teaming certifications, right? And I always ask, hey, what is your expertise and what are you trying to get out of it? And the last part is stumps people because they want to get the tag and the reputation that comes with it, but not so much on how that adds into their knowledge, skills, or experience. And sometimes I've heard good answers like, hey, this certification gives me the experience that I can apply here in my career. Okay, that's a good answer. in my books. But if they say this gives me help a job right here and that's it and that's the end of the world, I ask them to think broader. I'm like, okay, this is step one. What about the next? Where do you want to go in the 5-10 years? I want to have that conversation and see if it really fits the trajectory rather than a step, right? Sometimes steps are okay, and I'll tell you which are those. Like vendor neutral certifications where they don't stress on selling a product and they're selling their systems or hardware. I prefer a lot of that. The reason is very simple, because they will, again, try to go back to the primitives a lot more than vendor focused ones. So the way I would choose it is prioritize vendor neutral ones in the beginning, definitely, because they are broader, they talk about more concepts. As you get specialized, and then it's fine to go vendor specific if that really helps you. Again, go figure out who's teaching it, what are they teaching, how it's adding value to you, and what stage of the career you're in. There are some, like, I think I know there's some certifications just super advanced, as in you need to take 5 of them before you even attempt the 6th one, right? And I would say, like, do you want to follow that chain and see the people who have the ultimate thing, what are they really doing these days? How have they used it? So I would look at that in terms of certification.
So when you're looking at like how are people using it,
Yeah.
Help us understand a little bit about what should they be looking for, in the sense of like, should I be looking for somebody who's started their junior security engineering and they're doing mostly engineering and maybe a little security, and then maybe there's more security, or they're becoming an architect, or are they becoming a CISO for that matter? That's where help us understand when somebody just doesn't have any idea.
Yeah, perfect. So a lot of let me not assume a job that is in the private industry. I'll assume, like, not assume that and go broader. There are jobs in the governments, different governments in the world, that require certain certifications. I believe CSSP is one of them that I've seen mentioned a lot, and you must have it. Great, no problem. Please go get it. I think I understand why you want to do it. It offers a broad knowledge. It talks about domains, so it fits the bill, if I may call it. I think what they should also be looking for is talk to people who have done it and see what roles they have taken up beyond. So people who have actually specialized in networking expertise, see, are they operating at architect level? Have they moved on to CISOs? If so, why? Did the certification help them? Honestly, sometimes you can't just research enough. You have to talk to people. So build that networking, build that contacts, and honestly ask people how it went for them. We are lucky now, honestly, when maybe you and I, Mike, started, we didn't have as much information, right? And so we had to really go old school and go network ourselves and talk and build that connection. We didn't have, I don't know, LinkedIn or other platforms then, or they were very, very sparingly used. So in terms of use, that's what I would focus on. I would also, especially for beginners, right? I would say I would not stress too much about certifications, because yes, they do help you check a box somewhere, but then there are ways to demonstrate the same knowledge or skill in different ways.
It's so I think this conversation overall is interesting. One thing I was thinking about as we've been going through here is your book going to be relevant in 5 or 10 years? And the way you're talking about it, I think it is, which is really interesting, right? Because frequently, like the example I gave before about clouds, or not cloud, but the LLMs, AI stuff, that's probably not going to be relevant in 24 months because it's just going to keep going whether it's here or not. But bringing this back a little bit closer, where did my brain go? I'm sorry. It feels like there's this basis. It's a great thing, right? Oh yeah, the number one thing which I'm always seeing is a student or someone just recently graduated. As you said, which certificate should I get? But man, they really focus on that. No matter how many times we go on a podcast like this or tell them, don't worry, right? I think it's partially it's interesting, our industry, and this actually here's the question for you at the end of the day. How people are so freaked out about how did I get that job? It's so hard for people entering into security, AppSec particularly, because there's not very many junior jobs out there. Everyone wants someone who has 5 years of experience and the Splunks and all things you talked about. How do you get in? What do they go looking for a security job first, or do you go as you did, as a programmer? How do how do you suggest people to crack that nut?
Yeah, I think you're touching a point which is a little bit more nuanced, John. So let me try to break it down. If you have, so the path I had was a little bit more traditional, and I've seen throughout my career people with different, I guess I would call them entry points, to be a little bit more engineering focused, have different entry points, and then they navigate it a little bit more differently, but they ended up, either my peers or in the same team or in partner teams, right? I have seen, like, you don't need to do, and I'll break this myth also, you don't need to do a security focused degree. You can actually have, you can work in IT, right? You can get the experience that way and the knowledge and skills that way. You can work your way up into, not niche jobs like, oh, I want to have 5 years AppSec experience to pen test this particular app and find all the vulnerabilities on HackerOne and other platforms. No, I'm not looking for that. I'm actually looking for you to start, partnering with security teams first. That's a quick and easy way. You will be seen as you're adding value in the organization, no matter where you are, by the way. So you can be a different org and say, hey, I want to learn more about security. I want to figure out how the company is doing it. Volunteer if you have the time. Help them out, build the connections. One thing you will get out of, I can almost guarantee you'll get more out of it if you have that, what we started with, curiosity in the beginning. And using that, I think, is a great stepping stone to build that experience that people ask in the resumes and the job descriptions. I have seen extremely exciting paths that I did not ever imagine that this can lead to security, right? People who did not even go into IT just got curious about security. They did not pursue a degree. They actually started self-learning. Like they booted themselves up. They, participated in conferences. They built networks. I'm giving an example, by the way. They went and did CDFs. They built a team with CDFs and they got good at it. So they got some recognition. They multiplied on that, took some certifications, landed their first role using all of those, albeit an entry-level role, and then worked their way up. It's amazing how people do it. And so this is what we want you to capture in the book and in things we talk about daily, is you don't have to do what we did. Like, we are not saying you follow us. We are saying, end your journey, focus on the right things. That's all we're telling you.
It's fun. Really briefly on there, it's funny. One of my favorite, I've probably said this on here before, one of my favorite interview questions to ask people is, how do you learn? How do you keep up with technology?
Yeah.
And this is sort of bringing back that, right? It's sure, the college degree might be great, or the master's, whatever, but you're not going to be in that classroom all the time. So how do you have interest? Do you want to, and it's not bad. If you want to, if you're the type that you just want to use what you've got and you've learned and that's your career, cool. But my interest tends to be more around folks who are always hungry and trying to learn and figure out new things, or new ways to build things or break things or what have you. And I think that sort of ties in how you phrase that there. Sort of interesting.
Yeah, we're definitely sponsored by the letter C in terms of, like, these are careers and curiosity. And you mentioned, like, having those connections, those conferences, but de-emphasizing certificates. Those can be part of it, but that's not your goal.
Yeah.
And I think you've helped us understand very much about that goal, or that, how do you continue to learn? I snuck that C in there that John was just pointing out, of just, learning Fortran in your college course, 20, 30 years ago, probably not applicable today, despite however memory safe it may be.
Exactly.
But Karan, you have, you and your co-author, you've got a book. It's going to be, it hopefully will last that 5 to 10 years, so people can refer to it. It's not just here's ICMP that's old and crusty.
Yeah.
One of the questions we always like to ask our guests too is, AppSec is most likely to. So we're going to have you put on a little bit of a hat as a perhaps prognostication. How would you fill in that phrase? AppSec is most likely to what?
Most likely to get you to drink from a fire hose, but you'll survive happily at the end. No, I just read that one on the fly, to be honest. And I say that because, again, alluding to everything we talked about, right? As you start doing it, you find this huge depth of stuff you have to learn to figure things out. And then as you take steps, it gets easier and easier. And before you know it, you're looking at a source web page of a website and you're like, that's an issue, that won't work. Let me just this and you're done. Right. So I would even generalize that for security to some extent.
Yeah, and wonderful answer, because I think it ties back to just how you kicked everything off in that sense of, social media site, how does that work? Is someone going to take over my profile? If they
Yeah.
did, how would they do it? And this whole time you've talked about how to learn. We haven't touched on the font for your resume and how to look at your resume. You're looking at source code. You're looking at HTML source. So I very much appreciate, that type of insight, that type of help for our listeners. So thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. It's awesome to chat with you. And thank you for having me.
Thank you again. Thank you, John. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.